my PC into a desk with perfect cable management. So the idea here is to build a hollow desk, which is where all of the PC components will fit and completely be hidden. On top of that, we're going to build a channel in the back that's accessible with a removable panel in order to completely hide all of the cables. This will work by cutting slits along the top and bottom of the desk so every potential cable has passage to the PC. There will also be some access on the exterior of the desk with a small front I/O panel, which will also house the power button. Lastly, we're going with hairpin legs because they're the cheapest, lightest, and most minimal style of table legs. Okay, let's get building. The top and bottom panels need to be made out of aluminum to keep the desk as skinny as possible but also remain strong. We went ahead and ordered 2 sheets that were 24 by 50 inches. This will be the size of the desk. As for the frame, we're using 1 by 3 inch red oak boards. We picked this because it was a relatively cheap hardwood, and we plan on the total height of the desk being around 2 inches. After cutting the frame pieces to length, we began to cut the ends at 45 degrees so they can meet together on the corners as seamlessly as possible. Unfortunately, we didn't have access to a miter saw, so the table saw had to do. Next, we trimmed down the boards to the correct height, which was 1 3/4 of an inch. This is the total clearance we'll be working with, and nothing inside the desk can be taller than that. After making those cuts, we then had the exterior frame completed. Next, we cut the interior portion of the frame. This is needed because the board in the back is actually the removable panel and doesn't really provide any benefit to the structural integrity of the desk. We then began to cut pieces that would attach to the interior frame. The purpose of this is to make some stops for the removable panel that will later house some magnets. We quickly countersunk the wood and then screwed those in. We're now ready to permanently mount the top aluminum panel to the frame. We drilled some pilot holes around the perimeter and countersunk them so we can place a sheet of veneer on the top of the desk in the end. Before mounting the interior portion of the frame, there's still some work to be done on it. We notched out a hole so cables will be able to reach the motherboard and GPU when the time comes, as well as glued in some magnets into the stops that we made in part 2 so the back panel will stick in place. With this done, we can now permanently mount this piece along with the rest of the frame. Okay, time to finish up the back removable panel. We cut up some 2x4s to fill in the gaps in the corners. This is for attaching the surrounding pieces in a second here. But before that, we sliced off the ends of the back panel and cut it in half. The thought process here was to keep the corners looking more seamless and allowing half of the back panel to be removed at once without having to take the whole thing out. But in hindsight, I think it would have been better just to leave it as one piece. This is definitely something we'll improve on in the second build. The back panel is now done, however, and the frame is secured. Now that the top plate of the desk is permanently mounted, it's time to work on the bottom. Because we want to be able to access the PC components later on in case of upgrades, maintenance, or whatever, we won't be permanently mounting it like the top. Instead, we're going to place wooden inserts all along the perimeter of the frame so the bottom plate can be secured with machine screws and removed at any time. Again, credit to DIY Perks on YouTube for this amazing concept, and I'd also like to quickly note that this is the reason why we can't make the top see-through, as many of you have requested. The PC components will be mounted on the top upside down and accessed by removing the bottom plate. Don't get me wrong though, we like the idea and we'll definitely try to implement it in a future build. Anyway, now that the top and bottom are mounted, it's time to trim the excess aluminum that overhangs the frame. To do this, we used a router with a flush bit. It worked great, although we wouldn't have even had to have done this if we just cut the frame a little longer instead of making the desk exactly according to plan, which was 55 by 24 inches. We'll do this on the second build, however, because it just makes more sense. It's now time to cut the top and bottom cable slots. The purpose of the top ones is to feed cables from anything sitting on top of the desk, like a monitor, keyboard, speakers, etc., straight into these slots and into the PC. Whereas the purpose of the bottom is to do the same thing, but primarily just allow me to choose where the power cable comes out. Basically, these slots just allow for the most minimal amount of cables to be showing as possible. Okay, now it's time to get the desk standing. To mount the legs, we first cut up and glued together some 2x4s that'll be secured inside the desk so the legs have something to attach to. They look pretty ugly, but this is the inside of the desk, so they won't be seen in the end. After permanently securing these pieces to the top plate, we then once again added wooden inserts so the legs can be removed along with the bottom plate if it ever needs to come off. To finish up, we drilled some holes on the bottom plate right where the wooden inserts are located so the legs could be attached. Now the desk is standing and we're just about ready to start adding the actual PC components. It's finally time to start working on the airflow, which we're doing by cutting vents on the bottom of the desk. To make these vents, we simply cut out holes for all of the fans and we'll add a layer of mesh in between the two to help block out dust and anything else unwanted. We originally cut everything out with a jigsaw, but then realized we could have just 3D printed out some stencils and used a router for a much cleaner cut. So after already cutting everything out, we still went ahead and did that to touch it up, and it turned out a lot nicer. Also, as a side note, we recently ordered a CNC machine, so on the next desk build, we'll be able to precisely cut out everything, including including actual vents into the aluminum, not just big holes. Anyway, our airflow setup consists of 3 intake and 3 outtake vents. All of the intake vents will simply give pass-through airflow, as we're just going to use the fans that are already on the GPU and CPU, and all of the outtake vents will be using 120mm fans. With the airflow planned out, we can now move on to the internal components of the desk, starting with the standoffs for the motherboard. Next, we left off with the cooling all planned out, but now need to actually mount the exhaust fans on the inside. Again, we're using 120mm Noctua fans for this. Next up is the front panel I/O. For this, we 3D printed the actual panel in black PLA, and then secured the power button and PCB to it with hot glue. It has an SD and microSD card reader, as well as 2 USB Type-A's and a USB Type-C port. So it's pretty minimal, but that's what we were going for because these ports are just for quick access only. The more so permanent ports that you'd hook up a keyboard and mouse to, for example, are accessible in the back channel. Lastly, we mounted a power strip in the back channel. This will provide power to the PC as well as any electronics sitting on top of the desk. This will be the only cable coming out of the desk, with the possible exception of an Ethernet cable. Everything else will either be hidden or fed directly into the slots on top of the desk. We're now ready to start taking my PC apart and transferring the components into the desk. My PC is a little outdated, so the parts aren't the best, but they'll work for now, and they can always be upgraded later. The parts we took out were a 1080 Ti GPU, an i7-7700 CPU, an ITX motherboard with low profile RAM, and an SSD. We did have to buy a new power supply, however, that would fit in the small space we're working with, as well as a low profile CPU cooler to do the same. Okay, let's start mounting the parts. For some of the parts, we just used double-sided 3M tape, which is extremely strong and does get the job done, but in the second desk build, we're going to use custom designed brackets for every component, so it's a lot more secure and professional looking. Anyway, we did, however, 3D print out some brackets for the GPU. After all the parts were mounted, we did some cable management. Next, we added some long plastic strips surrounding the GPU, as well as the motherboard and PSU, and secured it with heat-resistant tape. The purpose of these barriers is to help direct the airflow and give these areas somewhat of a seal. Now the internals are fully complete, and the last step is to apply the finishing touches on the exterior, which we'll do. All we've got left to complete this build are the finishing touches on the exterior. To start things off, we rounded and sanded every corner. Next up is attaching the veneer top. To do this, we sanded the top plate and applied acetone to take off any oil or grease. Next, we applied contact cement to the top as well as the veneer and then placed it on the top of the desk. We then rolled it out to prevent any air pockets from forming and then clamped it down with some heavy plywood. After the contact cement cured, we trimmed off the excess veneer with a flush router bit and sanded all of the edges. Lastly, we stained the desk in a brownish grayish color and applied a few layers of satin clear coat. Once it all dried, the desk PC was finally done. Notice how the cable slots in the back perfectly manage all of the cords, and the only cable coming out of the PC is just the power cord. Stay tuned for the second build when we improve the design even further.